She was 24 years old and lived alone in an apartment she could barely afford. Next door lived a quiet man she hardly knew, until a wedding invitation changed everything. A desperate request, a door that opened, and a secret neither of them was ready to face. But before I take you into this story that will break your heart, tell me something. Where are you watching from right now? Write in the comments your city or country. I want to know who's here with me on this journey. Because what you're about to see isn't just a love story. It's about courage, truth, and the weight of the choices we make when our heart is on the line.
Callie Barrett was 24 years old and had the feeling that life had already passed her by without asking permission. She woke up before sunrise, drank cold coffee because there was no time left to heat it, and locked the door to apartment 12A with that metallic click that echoed through the empty hallway like a daily reminder. You're alone. The building was old, with walls that creaked and a stairwell that smelled of mildew and accumulated exhaustion. Every step she descended was one more step into the routine that swallowed her whole. Pharmacy, double shift, overdue bills, silence. But it was the silence that weighed heaviest. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that screams in the absence of someone to ask how your day was. In the narrow hallway, she crossed paths with him almost every morning. Wesley Higgins, apartment 12B. He was tall, wore simple clothes, faded jeans, gray t-shirt, sneakers that seen better days, and carried on his shoulders an invisible weight she recognized because she carried her own. They exchanged a nod, sometimes a mumbled, "Good morning." Nothing more than that. He left early, came back late, and Callie never knew exactly what he did. Not that it mattered. In New York, everyone lives next to strangers, and loneliness is as common as the sound of sirens at night.
She worked at the corner pharmacy, the one that stayed open late and served everyone from college students buying energy drinks to elderly people picking up medication for pains that life insisted on renewing. Callie knew every shelf, every product code, every customer complaint. Serenity, her coworker, was the only warm presence in that impersonal environment. Too talkative, nosy in just the right measure, the kind of person who pulls a smile out of you even when you don't want to give one. But not even Serenity's affection filled the emptiness Callie felt when she came home, opened the door and found only the echo of her own footsteps. Then came the envelope. Cream paper, elaborate handwriting, formal invitation to the wedding of Jenna Collins, Callie's cousin, undisputed queen of family gatherings, owner of a sharp smile and comments that cut like glass. Jenna always made a point of reminding everyone that Callie hadn't made it in life, that it was a shame she hadn't achieved anything better, that at least she had an honest job. Honest, as if that were consolation, as if dignity paid late rent. Callie held the invitation between trembling fingers and felt something break inside her chest. It wasn't anger, it was pure exhaustion from always being the one left over. For days, the invitation sat on the living room table, staring at her like a sentence. Going alone was unthinkable. Not going was admitting defeat. Callie knew the script. She'd walk in, everyone would look at her with that pity disguised as courtesy. Jenna would make some comment about how hard it is to find someone when you work so much, and she would smile. That trembling, restrained smile, hands pressed against her chest, trying to hold back the humiliation like someone trying to hold water in their hands. She'd lived through this before, and she swore she wouldn't live through it again.
It was on a Thursday night, after a shift that felt like it lasted 3 days, that desperation finally won over pride. Callie climbed the stairs slowly, the crumpled invitation inside her bag, her heart beating so hard she swore it would explode before she reached the 12th floor. She stopped in front of his door, apartment 12B, the peeling paint, the crooked metal number. She took a deep breath, raised her hand, and knocked. 3 quick knocks before the courage could disappear. The sound echoed through the hallway like a silent scream. "I can't keep doing this alone." Wesley opened a door slowly, his expression neutral but attentive, as if he were used to expecting the unexpected. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. Tired eyes, upright posture despite the weight he carried, a strange serenity that contrasted with the urgency she felt. Callie opened her mouth, but the words came out stumbling over each other. "I know this is going to sound absurd, but would you go with me to a wedding this Saturday? I'll pay you whatever you want, or I can cook for you for a month. I can't stand going alone and being humiliated anymore." The silence that followed was eternal. He watched her with an intensity she hadn't expected, as if he were reading between the lines of a book she didn't know she'd written. And then, with a calm that disarmed all her defenses, Wesley said, "You don't need to pay me anything. I'll go."
Callie spent all Friday trying to convince herself that this was real. Wesley had said yes, without hesitation, without asking for details, without charging anything in return. With every passing hour, she expected him to knock on her door and say he'd changed his mind, that he had commitments, that he'd realized how absurd the situation was. But he didn't show up. And when Saturday dawned with that typical New York gray sky, Callie found herself in front of the mirror wearing the only dress she owned, navy blue, simple, bought on sale 2 years ago, and feeling something she couldn't name. It wasn't hope. Maybe it was just the temporary absence of fear. He was waiting for her outside the building, punctual like someone who respects serious commitments. Callie descended the stairs slowly, her heart racing, and when she pushed through the stained glass door, she almost tripped over her own feet. Wesley was leaning against the brick wall, in a well-cut dark suit, impeccable white shirt, shoes that gleamed discreetly under the dim morning light. It wasn't ostentation, it was quiet elegance, the kind of presence that doesn't need to shout to be noticed. He looked up when he saw her, and something changed in his expression. It wasn't surprise, it was recognition, as if you were finally seeing the complete person, not just the shadow that crossed the hallway.
"You look beautiful," he said, and there was no trace of empty politeness in those words. Callie felt her face heat up, her hands automatically pressing against her chest, trying to contain the emotion that threatened to overflow. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice too thin. "And thank you for doing this." Wesley gave a half smile, the kind of smile that carries untold stories. "I said I would, and I don't usually go back on my word." He opened the door to the taxi he'd called, not just any Uber, but a real taxi, with a driver and a cap and everything, and gestured for her to get in. Callie slid into the back seat, the fabric worn but clean, and for the first time in months felt like someone was taking care of her. Not solving her problems, just caring. The wedding was at a venue on the Upper East Side, the kind of place that exudes money without needing neon signs. Crystal chandeliers, tables covered with immaculate white tablecloths, flowers that cost more than Callie's rent. Her stomach turned when they walked in. All the familiar faces, all the rehearsed smiles, all the looks that said, "Oh, she came, and look, she brought someone." Jenna was at the center of everything. Wedding dress that seemed to have been sewn by angels. Perfect smile plastered on her face as she received compliments like they were tributes. When she saw Callie, her eyes lit up, not with joy, but with opportunity.
"Callie, what a surprise that you came." Jenna's voice was poisoned honey. She approached, the dress rustling, and looked Wesley up and down with predatory curiosity. "And who is—" Callie felt her throat close, but before she could stammer an answer, Wesley extended his hand with calm confidence. "Wesley Higgins, pleasure to meet you."
Jenna shook his hand, her eyes still assessing, trying to fit him into some category. Rich, important, or just another poor soul like her cousin? Pleasure, Higgins. And what do you do, Wesley? The question came loaded with intention, and Callie wanted to disappear. But Wesley just smiled, polite and impenetrable. I work in investments, nothing too exciting. And he redirected the conversation with a skill that only someone used to dealing with difficult people possesses. The ceremony was long, pompous, full of eternal promises that Callie couldn't believe anyone actually kept. She spent most of the time observing Wesley out of her corner of eye. He was attentive, respectful, but there was a stiffness in his shoulders that she recognized. He didn't like being there. Even so, he stayed. During dinner, the comments began. Aunt Margaret asked where Callie had found Wesley, with that tone suggesting she didn't deserve to find anyone. Uncle Robert made a joke about honest jobs that drew laughter from the table. And Jenna, always Jenna, said with a sweet smile, "Callie, it's so good to see that you finally have someone by your side. It must be hard to work so much and still have energy for, a personal life." The silence that followed was awkward. Callie lowered her eyes, her hands trembling under the table. That's when Wesley spoke. He didn't yell, didn't make a scene. He simply turning to Jenna with cutting calm and said, "Actually, Callie works harder than most people I know, and unlike a lot of people, she does it without needing to put anyone down to feel important." The silence changed in nature. It became dense, uncomfortable. Jenna forced a smile, but her eyes flashed. Callie was paralyzed, her heart beating so hard she thought everyone could hear it. No one had ever done this for her. No one had ever looked at the people who hurt her and said, "This isn't right." In the taxi back, Mark Ellison, the driver, drove in silence, but Callie could sense he'd picked up on the tension. Wesley was looking out the window, his jaw slightly tight. And then, without taking his eyes off the city passing by outside, he said quietly, "Why do you let those people make you feel small? You work harder than all of them put together." Callie didn't answer, because there was no answer. There was only the naked truth. For the first time, someone had seen her.
After that Saturday, something changed in the 12th floor hallway. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was like when a door creaks for the first time in years and you realized it was always there, just waiting to be opened. On Monday morning, when Callie locked the door to apartment 12A, Wesley was leaving at the same time. They looked at each other, and this time the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged with something new, something neither of them quite knew how to name. "Coffee?" he asked, just like that, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Callie blinked, surprised, and before fear could stop her, she answered, "Coffee." And that's how it began, with a steaming cup, a table too small for two, and the discovery that sometimes the best connections are born in the most unlikely places. His apartment was as simple as hers, maybe even more so. White walls without pictures, basic furniture that seemed to be bought for the lowest price possible, a bookshelf with few books, Walden by Henry David Thoreau, Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, The Monk and the Executive by James C. Hunter. Books about detachment, about finding meaning, about living with less. Callie observed everything while he prepared coffee in an old Italian coffee maker that hissed softly on the stove. There was something contradictory there. The simplicity was chosen, not imposed. She knew the difference. Her own simplicity was the result of necessity, of bills that didn't add up, of choices that weren't really choices. But his seemed intentional, and that intrigued her more than she wanted to admit.
"How long have you lived here?" she asked, accepting the cup he offered. Wesley sat down on the other side of the table, his hands wrapping around his own cup as if he needed the warmth. 6 months, he answered. Before that, I lived somewhere else, but I needed something different. Callie waited for him to continue, but he didn't continue. There was a wall there, invisible but solid, and she recognized it because she had her own. They drank in silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled with empty words. Outside, New York was waking up with its chaotic symphony of horns, sirens, and hurried footsteps. But in that cramped kitchen, the world seemed smaller, slower, almost bearable. It was Wesley who broke the silence. "You were right, about the wedding. Those people, they don't see you." Callie lowered her eyes to her cup, feeling the familiar knot in her throat. "They never have," she murmured. "I'm the poor cousin, the one who didn't make it, the one who got left behind." The last word came out with brutal weight, and she almost regretted saying it. But Wesley didn't look away. He leaned slightly forward, his voice firm but gentle. "You didn't get left behind. You survived. And that's worth infinitely more than anything they have." Callie felt her eyes burn, her hands instinctively pressing against her chest. She didn't cry. She never cried in front of anyone. But something inside her gave way just a little.
The following days turned into an unexpected routine. Coffee in the morning, short conversations in the hallway, sometimes an improvised dinner where each brought what they had. She pasta with tomato sauce, he French bread and real butter, the expensive kind that melts in your mouth. Callie discovered that Wesley had a low, rare laugh, that he read a lot but spoke little, and he had a way of listening that made you feel like your words actually mattered. He told her he worked in investments, that he'd spent years in a suffocating routine, that one day he woke up and realized he no longer knew his own life. She told him about her distant mother, about the pharmacy, about Serenity, who kept asking, who was the handsome guy at the wedding? And for the first time in years, Callie laughed, really laughed, without forcing it, without holding back. But then came the morning when Mrs. Davenport knocked on the door of apartment 12A, with that look of someone coming to collect old debts. The landlady was a 58-year-old woman, gray hair pulled into a tight bun, permanently irritated expression as if life had charged her abusive interest and she was passing the bill along. "Mrs. Davenport," she said, and the tone already carried the sentence. "The rent is late. Again." Callie felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. "I know, Mrs. Davenport, I swear that next week. You said that last month and the month before." The woman crossed her arms, relentless. "If it's not paid by the 15th, I'll need to start the eviction process. It's not personal, dear. It's business." And she left, leaving Callie alone in the hallway, the world crumbling around her like a condemned building.
Wesley appeared minutes later, probably alerted by the sound of the argument. He found Callie sitting on the hallway floor, her back against the door, her face hidden in her hands. He crouched down beside her, said nothing for a long moment, just stayed there. When she finally lifted her head, eyes red but dry, he spoke quietly. "Let me help you." Callie shook her head vehemently. "No, I'm not going to accept charity." "It's not charity, it's a loan. You pay it back when you can." "No." Her voice came out harder than she intended. "I already owe too many people too much. I'm not going to owe you too." Wesley sighed, ran his hand through his hair, clearly frustrated but respecting her boundary. "Okay," he finally said, "but if you change your mind, I won't change my mind." She stood up, what dignity remained still standing, and went into the apartment without looking back. But her heart was screaming a truth that pride wouldn't let out. "I wish I could accept. I wish I could trust."
Callie got the rent money. Don't ask how. Extra shifts, favors asked of coworkers, a week sleeping 4 hours a night and living on coffee and toast. When she finally handed the envelope to Mrs. Davenport, the feeling wasn't victory. It was exhaustion so deep that even breathing seemed like a conscious effort. But she'd done it, alone, as always, because that's what Callie Barrett did. She survived, even when the world insisted on making survival a heroic act. Wesley noticed. In the following days, he watched her with that silent concern, but said nothing. Didn't offer help again, didn't push, just stayed nearby, like someone standing guard without making a fuss. It was on a Thursday afternoon, one of those when the New York sky seems to carry the weight of all the sad stories ever lived in the city, that Callie made the mistake.
Or maybe it was fate. She'd grabbed his mail by accident. The mailman always mixed up the 12A and 12B boxes, and when she knocked on Wesley's apartment door, no one answered. The door was ajar, just a crack, the kind of crack that invites curiosity, that whispers, "Come in, just for a second." Callie pushed slowly, calling his name. Silence. She entered, the mail in her hand, her eyes scanning that space she already knew, but that now, empty, seemed different, more vulnerable, more real. And then she saw it. On the simple living room table, between a half-finished cup of coffee and an open book, there were documents, official papers with corporate letterheads, numbers that had many zeros, words like CEO, shares, net worth, and on top of everything, a printed magazine article, Forbes, page 42, with a photo of him, Wesley Higgins, not in faded jeans and gray t-shirt, but in an impeccable suit, confident posture, the kind of photo that screams power. The headline read, "Tech's Quiet Genius, How Wesley Higgins Built a Billion-Dollar Empire at 32. Callie felt the ground open beneath her feet, the air vanished from her lungs, her hands began to tremble, not from nervousness, but from something worse. Betrayal, humiliation, the brutal feeling of having been seen as pathetic by someone who could solve her entire life with a signature.
She didn't even hear when he came in, only noticed his presence when Wesley spoke, his voice low, loaded with something that seemed like fear. "Callie." She turned slowly, holding the papers like they were evidence of a crime. Her eyes met his, and what he saw there destroyed him. It wasn't anger. It was pure disappointment. "Billionaire," she said, her voice coming out strange, distant. "You're a billionaire." Wesley took a step forward, hands raised like someone trying to calm a wounded animal. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" Her voice rose, breaking at the edges. "That you saw me begging for help, saw me desperate over $300 in late rent, and just stood there, watching, knowing you could fix everything with the stroke of a pen?" "It wasn't like that." He tried to get closer, but she backed away. "I didn't want you to see me that way. I didn't want anyone to see me that way." "So you preferred to see me humiliated?" Callie threw the papers on the table. Her breathing accelerated, her hands shaking so much she had to cross her arms to hide them. "Do you know what I went through? Do you know how many hours I worked to get that money? And you were here, in this fake apartment, living this fake life, treating me like some kind of social experiment?" Wesley closed his eyes for a moment, jaw clenched, and when he opened them, there was pain there. Real pain, the kind you can't fake. "I sold everything, Callie, or I'm selling it. The company, the properties, everything. Because I spent 10 years building something that was killing me inside. And when I moved here, for the first time in a decade, I could breathe. I could just be Wesley."
"And me?" Her voice came out in a torn whisper. "What was I to you? A convenient reminder of how authentic, simple life is? A nice little story to make you feel human again?" "No." He took another step, and this time she didn't back away, but only because she was cornered between anger and pain. "You were the first person in years who looked at me and didn't see money, who didn't want anything from me except company, presence. You have no idea how much that meant." Callie let out a bitter laugh without humor. "And you have no idea how much it hurts to discover that the only person who seemed to really see me was lying the whole time." The silence that fell between them was dense, suffocating, full of things neither knew how to say. Wesley ran his hand over his face, exhausted in a way that went far beyond the physical. "I never lied about how I feel," he said, his voice broken at the edges. "Everything that happened between us was real. The coffee, the conversations, the wedding. I defended you because it was the right thing to do, not because I had money and you didn't, but because you deserved to be defended." Callie shook her head, tears finally escaping, hot and angry, streaming down her face. "Get out! Callie! Get out!" The shout echoed in the small apartment, and Wesley froze. He looked at her one more time, at this woman who had made him want to be someone better, someone real, and realized he'd lost the only thing that truly mattered. He nodded slowly, defeated, and walked to the door. He stopped in the doorway, without looking back. "I'm sorry for everything I couldn't be," and he left.
3 days later, Andrew Patel appeared on the 12th floor hallway. Corporate lawyer, immaculate suit, leather briefcase under his arm, professional but not cold expression. He knocked on the door of 12B, and when Wesley opened it, Andrew extended a thick envelope. "It's all ready. The sale is finalized. You're no longer CEO. You don't own anything anymore." Wesley took the envelope, felt its weight, not just the weight of the paper, but the weight of an entire decade being closed. "Thank you, Andrew." The lawyer hesitated, as if he wanted to say something more, but just nodded. Before leaving, he turned one last time. "I hope it's worth it, Wesley. I really do." And Wesley stood there, alone in the empty hallway, holding proof that he'd given up everything, because it was the only way to be someone real. But now, without her on the other side of the wall, he wondered if there was still meaning in anything.
5 months passed like pages torn from a book, too fast, leaving only ragged edges and the feeling that something important was lost. Callie didn't see Wesley anymore. He moved out 3 weeks after that devastating afternoon, and apartment 12B sat empty for weeks before someone new occupied the space. She tried to convince herself that she was relieved, that life had returned to normal. Work, home, silence. But the truth was that normal now felt hollow, like an echo of something that once had substance. Serenity noticed, of course. "You're different," she'd say, genuine concern in her eyes. Quieter, more distant. Callie would just smile, that trembling, restrained smile, and change the subject. Because how do you explain that you lost something you never had the right to call your own? It was in early fall that her body began to speak louder than stubbornness. First came the fatigue, not the common fatigue of double shifts, but an exhaustion that stuck to her bones and wouldn't leave even with sleep. Then came the pains, subtle at first, like whispers you ignore until they become screams. Callie attributed everything to stress, to poor nutrition, to years of systematic neglect of her own health, until one day, in the middle of her shift at the pharmacy, the world simply tilted. She grabbed onto the counter, vision blurring, and Serenity screamed her name as if she were on the other side of a very long tunnel. The floor rose too fast to meet her. And then, darkness.
The hospital smelled of disinfectant and broken promises. Callie woke up in a narrow bed, rough white sheets, fluorescent lights that seemed to judge every bad choice she'd ever made. Dr. Samuel Price was beside the bed, expression calm but serious. That kind of calm doctors learn to use when they need to deliver bad news with dignity. He was 50 years old, gray hair at the temples, steady hands that had held other hands trembling with fear. "Miss Barrett," he began, and the tone already said everything. "We need to talk about your test results." Callie didn't cry when he explained, didn't scream, didn't deny, didn't ask, "Why me?" She just lay there, staring at the stained ceiling, thinking about how ironic it was spending your whole life fighting to survive, only to discover that your body had decided to give up. Treatment was expensive, absurdly expensive, the kind of expensive that turns hope into cruel mathematics. Callie did the calculations mentally while Dr. Price talked about options, about quality of life, about doing what's possible within your circumstances. She had savings that barely paid 2 months' rent, didn't have decent health insurance, didn't have family who could help. Her mother could barely take care of herself, and Jenna. Well, Jenna would probably use this as more proof that Callie hadn't made it in life. It was Serenity who stayed. Serenity, with her persistent cheerfulness that now carried a weight of poorly disguised sadness, who brought magazines, who tried to make jokes, who held Callie's hand when the pain got too strong to pretend everything was okay.
3 months of treatment, and Callie was thinner, paler, closer to the end than the beginning. She was transferred to palliative care in a quiet wing of the hospital, where people came to make peace with their own mortality. And it was there, on a November afternoon when rain tapped gently against the windows, that the room door opened and Wesley walked in. Callie thought she was hallucinating. He looked different, thinner too, unshaven, simple clothes that had been washed so many times the colors had faded. None of the impeccable suit, none of the polished presence, just a tired man who seemed to have crossed the entire world to get there. She tried to speak, but her voice failed. He approached slowly, like someone approaching something fragile that might break at any moment. "Hi," he said, and the word came out loaded with everything that hadn't been said in recent months. Callie felt the tears, the one she'd held back for so long, finally escape. "How did you—" "Serenity found me," Wesley explained, pulling up a chair and sitting beside the bed. "She said that you were here." He swallowed hard, his eyes shining in a way that showed he'd also cried, probably a lot, away from everyone. "I would have come sooner if I'd known." Callie shook her head, weakly. "You didn't need to come. I know." He took her hand, careful, reverent. "But I wanted to." And he stayed. Wesley stayed. Not for days, but for weeks. Not using a penny of the fortune he technically still had in some forgotten account, but simply staying. He slept in an uncomfortable chair, ate the bad food from the hospital cafeteria, read to her when the pain was too strong to talk, passages from Walden, from Siddhartha, from books that talked about finding meaning in small things.
Dr. Price observed everything with that silent compassion of someone who'd seen many stories unfold in hospital rooms. He saw how Wesley cared for her, adjusted the pillows, moistened her dry lips with ice, held her hand during pain crises, whispered that he was there, that he wasn't going anywhere. "Are you two married?" the doctor asked once, curious. Wesley hesitated. "No, but she's the most important person I've ever known." Dr. Price nodded, understanding, because love doesn't need certificates to be real. It just needs presence. And Wesley was present, in the suffering, in the indignity of illness, in the slow goodbye that neither wanted to say out loud. There was no mansion, no money solving problems, nothing but a man who had chosen to stay when the whole world gave reasons to leave. One night, when the moon came through the window and everything was quiet except for the constant beep of monitors, Callie called his name. Wesley, who had fallen asleep in the chair, woke immediately, leaning close. "I'm here," he said. She looked at him, really looked at him, like she'd looked that first morning when he offered coffee, and saw everything he was. Not the billionaire, not the CEO, not the man who hid secrets. Just Wesley, the man who had defended her at a wedding, who had offered coffee, who had given up everything to be real, and who was now there, in the worst moment, proving that love isn't about saving anyone, it's about staying. Callie squeezed his hand, weak but intentional, and whispered the only truth that mattered. "You were the best neighbor I could have asked for." Wesley felt something break inside his chest, but he smiled, a smile wet with tears, full of gratitude for having had the chance to love her, even if for such a short time.
Apartment 12B still had her scent, not literally. Wesley had washed the sheets, opened the windows, let the fresh spring air come in and carry away the physical traces. But there was something that remained, something that couldn't be washed or aired out. Her presence was in the small things, in the blue cup she always used for coffee, now stored on the shelf like a sacred relic, in the poetry book he'd read to her in her final days, bookmarks still on the page where he stopped, in the simple vase by the window where he'd planted violets, her favorite flowers, which she mentioned once almost offhandedly in a conversation about childhood and gardens she never had. Wesley woke up every morning and looked at that vase, watered the flowers with meticulous care, and allowed himself to feel the pain. Because that's what he'd learned. Pain isn't the enemy. Pain is proof that something mattered. 6 months had passed since that night in the hospital. 6 months since he held her hand for the last time, felt the weak and final squeeze, saw peace finally come to that face that had carried so much exhaustion for so long. Dr. Price was there, discreet and respectful, offering Callie the dignity of departing without haste, without machines fighting against the inevitable. Wesley stayed until dawn, holding her hand even after the warmth left, because letting go seemed like betrayal. Serenity showed up just before noon, eyes swollen, and it was she who finally said, voice broken but firm, "Wesley, you need to let her go." And he did, but carrying her in his heart, that he would never let go of.
The life Wesley chose didn't look much different from the life he had before meeting her. He still lived in the same building. Mrs. Davenport had been visibly surprised when he renewed the lease, but didn't ask questions. He still worked, but now as a freelance financial consultant, helping small businesses organize their finances, charging little, living on even less. There was no mansion, no driver, no board meetings. There was coffee in the morning, walks through the neighborhood, conversations with neighbors who had previously been invisible to him. There was reading in public parks, cheap lunches at family restaurants, quiet nights where silence wasn't suffocating but contemplative. And there was her absence, which paradoxically made everything more present, more real, more important. Serenity visited sometimes. She'd become a kind of involuntary guardian of Callie's memory, bringing stories from the pharmacy, remembering inside jokes, keeping alive the image of the friend she'd lost. On a rainy Saturday in April, she showed up with a cardboard box. "I found this cleaning out her locker," Serenity explained, eyes shining with contained emotion. "These were things from her apartment. The landlady was going to throw everything away, but I couldn't let that happen." Wesley opened the box slowly, reverently. Inside there was so little. Some clothes, the navy blue dress she wore to the wedding, old notebooks with notes about grocery lists and bills to pay, a faded photo of her as a child, smiling at the camera with an innocence that adult life had erased. He held the photo between his fingers, feeling the disproportionate weight of that piece of paper. "Thank you," he said, voice hoarse, "for not letting her be forgotten." Sometimes, usually on Sunday afternoons when the world seemed to slow down, Wesley would sit at the same table where they'd had coffee for the first time and try to remember every word she said. Callie had been economical with words, not for lack of thought, but from a lifetime of learning that her words didn't carry weight for others. But every sentence she let out to him, every shy laugh, every moment of vulnerability, Wesley kept like someone keeping treasures. He remembered her saying that morning after the wedding, "Thank you for doing this," and the genuine gratitude in that simple phrase. He remembered her refusing financial help with fierce dignity that made him admire her even more. He remembered her crying, angry and hurt when she discovered the truth, and how that pain was fair, deserved, real. Callie had taught him that truly living hurts, but that pain is preferable to the anesthesia of a false life. Andrew Patel called once, a few months after the funeral, professional but not cold, voice asking how Wesley was doing, if he needed anything, if he was sure about the decisions he'd made.
"You could come back, you know," Andrew said, carefully. "The company was sold, but you still have contacts, resources, opportunities. You don't have to live like this." Wesley was silent for a moment, looking at the vase of violets in the window, at the simple apartment that had become a real home. "I know I don't have to," he finally answered, "but I want to. She taught me that having less and feeling more is worth infinitely more than the opposite." Andrew didn't insist, just wished him luck and hung up, and Wesley knew that was probably the last time he'd speak with anyone from that old world, and he was at peace with that.
On a June morning, exactly 6 months after her last breath, Wesley woke up early, made coffee in the old Italian coffee maker that had become emotional inheritance, and left the building. The air was warm, the sun already strong despite the hour, the city waking up with its chaotic energy. He walked to the small park 3 blocks away, the same park where Callie had mentioned, in a conversation forgotten by her, but not by him, that she used to go as a child before life got too heavy for moments of lightness. Wesley sat on a worn wooden bench, drank his coffee slowly, and for the first time in months, breathed without feeling his chest tighten. It wasn't that the pain had gone away, it was that he'd learned to carry it differently. Callie wasn't there anymore, but what she had awakened in him, the courage to live with truth, to choose connection over comfort, to find dignity in simplicity, that was there, and always would be. He closed his eyes, felt the sun on his face, and whispered to the wind, "Thank you for teaching me how to live." And the wind, gentle and indifferent, carried the words to wherever rested souls go. Wesley stood up, threw the empty cup in the trash, and walked back home. Not because he needed to be somewhere, but because he finally knew who he was. And that, he discovered, was freedom.
The story of Callie and Wesley didn't end that June morning. In fact, it never ends. Because the best stories aren't the ones that close with perfect endings, but those that leave permanent marks on the people who live them. Callie left, yes, taking with her the pain of a life that was harder than it should have been. But she also left something precious, living proof that an ordinary person with limited resources and deep scars can completely transform someone's life simply by existing with authenticity. Wesley sold an empire, gave up everything the world considers valuable, and discovered that the greatest wealth he ever possessed was the privilege of having coffee with a woman who saw him as human. Just as she discovered that love can change everything, each of us also carries that power of transformation within ourselves, not through grand gestures, but through the courage to be real, to stay when it would be easier to leave, to see dignity where the world sees only survival. Stories like this remind us that it's never too late to start over and believe in love. They remind us that true connections don't happen in perfect settings, but in cramped hallways, improvised coffees, and moments of vulnerability we'd prefer to hide. They remind us that sometimes the right person appears when we least expect it, as a silent neighbor, as a stranger who says yes when everyone else said no, as a presence that chooses to stay on the hardest days. And they remind us, above all, that love doesn't need to last forever to be eternal, because what we feel, what we learn, what we become because of someone, that never dies. Callie lived 24 years, but in those final weeks beside Wesley, she lived more fully than many live in entire decades. And Wesley, who had everything and had nothing, finally understood that truly living means allowing others to touch your soul, even knowing it hurts.
If you saw in Callie the daily struggle for dignity, if you saw in Wesley the desperate search for authenticity, if you felt in your chest the weight of transformative love, write in the comments, "Love transforms lives. Because by sharing this truth, you don't just honor the memory of fictional characters, you honor all the real Callies and Wesleys who cross our paths daily asking only to be seen. You honor the courage of those who love despite fear, who stay despite pain, who choose to feel despite knowing everything is temporary. And by doing that, you spread a seed of hope in a world that often seems to have forgotten that small connections build great transformations. Subscribe to Eternal Romance Stories and experience with each episode emotions that warm the soul and reflections that transform the heart. Here, you won't find just sugary stories of conventional happy endings. You'll find narratives that respect the complexity of human love with its contradictions, its fears, its scars, and its silent victories. Stories that make you cry, yes, but also make you think, feel, question, and in the end, believe again, because we all need reminders that it's worth risking the heart, that vulnerability is strength, that being truly seen by someone is one of the greatest gifts life can offer. And each video on this channel is an invitation for you to pause the rush, take a deep breath, and remember that love stories, the real ones, the imperfect ones, the ones that hurt and heal at the same time, are what make the human experience worth living.
And this was just one of many stories that will still move you here, because as long as there are people seeking true connection, as long as there are hearts brave enough to love despite everything, as long as there are silent neighbors who become unexpected saviors, there will be stories to tell. The next one might be about a ballerina who lost her movements but found the music of the heart, or about a lonely chef who discovered that the best seasoning is the right company, or about two wounded souls who met on a rainy night and decided together that it's worth trying again. We don't know yet, but we know you'll be here, heart open, ready to feel, ready to believe, because that's what we're made of. Stories that pierce through us and transform us one word at a time, one heartbeat at a time, one love at a time.